I'm going to start with the question. I'd like to ask Rafael, actually, just a point of clarification on the public garden. That, to me, means you don't pay a fee to get up there.
You don't.
And if that's the case, how are you going to control that? Because, you know, in Hong Kong, there are many spaces high up in tall buildings, the Bank of China being one where you can literally just wander up there on yourself. There's no fee, there's no security, there's no... In a city like London, where that would be the first space where that is allowed, it would be massively inundated on an everyday basis. So how do you intend to control? There must be some form of control.
Absolutely no idea.
Good answer.
Katrina Kostik-Saman, Kekia Strategy Architect. Thank you for your presentations this morning. I've had pleasure to work in some capacity in all three buildings that you've mentioned this morning, and they all are extremely iconic, or potentially will be iconic. But they're all from the outside perspective that we've spoken about today. And going on with Anthony's question, actually, all of them typically are impenetrable. There's no way you can get into the Gherkin unless you're been vetted about 20 minutes or 20 times to get in there. It is highly likely that 20 Fenchurch will have a controlled access as well. And the Shard, you do have to pay. So how do we harness the excitement and passion and enthusiasm of the public when they're not allowed into these beautiful buildings?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting issue, and I think there needs to be a balance between the purpose of the building, and as I've pointed out, its commercial purpose, which is extremely important in seeing these built, and their function, and also the public's access. I think there are spaces, and some buildings will have that, and they're indeed, I think, part of their planning approval. In the Gherkin, we don't have that, and indeed, that's available for the tenants and their clients and people who are willing to pay a fee. There are times, however, that we do open it to the public. The example is the stair run that I gave you, and an annual one that's held every year where people can access the building. And also there's an event, I think, that you will know about. The architects hold an open day of buildings around the city, and people queue to get access to the Gherkin over that weekend.
Irvine, would you like to address that question?
Yes, you can get access to the Shard. You can get access to the restaurants, and there'll be a number of them. I said there'll be 8 separate food offerings at levels 31 to 33. So go there, the views are beautiful. You can also go into the hotel. Hotels are generally open to the public, so I don't really understand the point. This is a building that is open to the public. There is a charge for the hotel, but you don't pay to get in there, you pay for a room rate. And the viewing gallery, there is a charge for that. So I think at all levels, it's a very open building to the public.
I think these are new problems, the same way that these are new contributions to the urban fabric. I think that one has to be optimistic about this process through which the permeability of the building for the public is really guaranteed, but it is also a matter of education, a sort of mutual education. One of the most interesting aspects of architecture is not so much how it looks like, but what happens to it when people really appropriate it. And as you, the person that asked the question probably points out to the hermeticity of some buildings. I do believe that even though you have to pay to go up to the Shard, Irving be nice enough to give us some free days, I mean, in the future. But that's a dialogue. Am I right?
Yes,
Isn't that a good idea? You just said, you know, for instance, on Saturdays every other month or so. And it seems to me that that's a question that goes a little bit beyond design. We tend to think that we can social engineer people, and I don't think that's the case. And the physical difference I think is what is important. I mean, you know, the Shard is a small space at the top, absolutely a wonderful piece of architecture and a fabulous building. 25th Church is a large space. I think in that level, that doesn't make it better or worse, it's just different. And I think that the process, in the same way in which this date, which I have never participated in, but they tell me that it's really great, this sort of kind of visiting story. That's something that happens in this town. And, you know, for instance, in New York, we're trying to copy it with relative success because, you know, the hamburgers actually take care of all the visits, I mean, more uncleanly than desired. But it is a question of how the city establishes this dialogue with its citizens. And I think that more likely than not, the uses and the sense of accessibility will change with time.
Did you get zoning bonuses for giving public realm, those public gardens? Did you get some zoning bonuses? And secondly, did you buy the air rights of the surrounding low-rise buildings to protect your panoramic views in the future?
Are you asking me or Irwin?
Yeah,
Irwin. There is no air rights for Irwin's. I mean, it's just too tall. And
The surroundings.
I have no idea, again, about whether the developers have bought more property, but I can tell you that it works differently. I think that one of the beautiful aspects of the planning process here is that because it's so discursive, all of these issues are not only dominated by financial insurances. I mean, it's more how the planners see the visibility of the building and not just an abstract mechanism through which you have an as of right given condition or that you can actually purchase it. It is 100% much more negotiated. But in that sense, I think the role of the planning agencies here is by far more active than in other parts of the world, in my view. And I think it's for the better. I'm not so sure that even if you had all the money in the world, that you know, where do you stop buying air rights, right? I mean, you know, with a building like the Shard, if you wanted to protect, you have to buy half of London, right? And some other parts of
we did
the UK.
we did negotiate rights of light issues because we did have impact.
Yeah, but that's a different thing, isn't it?
That's, well, rights of light. That's
No. He's saying you buy the rights such that another guy cannot build a tower next to yours, right?
Is that right?
That's
Good,
what he
I like
meant.
that
That's I come from kind of like the same type of legislation.
I mean, actually, it's a very interesting point. Again, you know, if you look at Hong Kong is commercialism run rampant, and there are many towers that have been developed there that 5-10 years later, more land is reclaimed and more towers are put up there. And it struck me the other night, you know, it's fantastic at the top of the Gherkin, but that view is becoming increasingly, it's still a brilliant view, but, you know, there are towers all around there. And, you know, Heron Tower, for example, has the whole of its southern facade on the elevator bank covered in solar panels, and Brookfield have the site opposite there, and, you know, probably there's going to be a tall building there. So, you know, how much should we legislate or control future developments based on one tall building?
Well, we're all right because we're close to the river and we haven't been able to build on rivers yet, so I think we're going to be safe there.
But you live in Chicago, right? I mean, absolutely spectacular place. And you couldn't produce the synergy that occurs between these masses. I mean, forget just the typical notion of what's the skyline. The vibrancy of a vertical experience where you can actually change the pattern of how you relate to the urban fabric is something that happens in the American city in a much freer way, and there isn't any way you can protect it. And I think that's for the better in many cases.
Kent?
I think one of the interesting things is, you know, at some level it is sought to be protected. And you see that in relation to the Gherkin at the time it was built. And I talked about the proposal that was there for a much taller tower. and it was then constrained by what was already there. And then the next building comes along and it's a little larger, and the constraints again change. And that's what we've seen in the city, I think. And Rafael, you drew the red lines of the arcs referencing the other buildings. But those red lines continue to rise or change as the other buildings are built and they change the skyline.
Yeah, it's a social conversation. I presume that in retrospect, most of the people that were not only, that's another incredible phenomena. I mean, you know, apart from all your trademarking problems, I do think the building is a remarkable piece of structure. It's just I wish it would have been 10-story higher. I mean, I'm sure you do too. But that process, when the parameters that actually guided the whole discourse to kind of end up with this height were different than today. And that's one of the most critical things in planning. Actually, architecture has a terrible conflict with planning in general because, you know, we as architects want to see the picture, right? Well, there isn't any picture. And there isn't any picture you can actually draw because these things are the results of social forces. And it seems to me that the balance is in understanding the synergy between private capital and public capital. And that's a completely philosophical issue which democracy deals with, but not always very successfully, right? That, you know, you deal with the subject of what the public is entitled to do and have, and what makes the city be what the city is, which is essentially investment, either public or private. And that's one of the failures of the present moment, which is that the capacity of the public sector to invest, the zero capacity of the public sector to invest, is a tragedy, I think. You know, most of the things that make places remarkably memorable are the result of public investment. And that has vanished too. And so the dialogue is now talking to Irving to give us another little park somewhere because he's making a pile of money somewhere else. I mean, that's all great, but it would be fabulous if the public coffers were a little bit more fuller, I think.
From a Danish perspective, we think that French Church Street is a very, very exciting public space. I was just wondering, do you think it is unfortunate that the sculpting, the shaping, and the messing of the building has hijacked or has distracted from the essence of your building, which is the public realm at the top?
We couldn't have actually generated the size of space if we wouldn't have shifted the massing towards the top. You know, one may criticize the sort of kind of the curvilinear component of it. But as I say, that to me is a stylistic subject. I think that the building, at least in my estimation, I mean, tomorrow I'm submitting a competition for a building, and I was told that, how was it exactly? That everything is done, and you know that you cannot. There are innumerable amount of buildings in the history of architecture that have this partie. The Torre Velasca in Milano, for instance, is a building like this. Nobody paid attention to it, but if you really go back to Rogers, you know, Richard's uncle, the Velasca Tower has exactly the same idea. It's a shaft with a series of apartments above the level of the medium datum of Milano. And I always thought that this was something that people had not actually focused on. So, if, for instance, there is a certain blockage of space that you can build. If you build it at the top, you don't build anything below, because it's not that you can actually continue doing it vertically, because you know you're outside of the regulation. So, I think that, as I said, I do think that the building makes sense, which is something that is not very common today. I think I can explain it, not that I generated it in that sort of kind of linear fashion, but I think that architecture is like this. I mean, you find meaning in the process, in the creative process, and also in the critics' opinions of it. But I think that the building makes sense. It's curvilinear because of the pattern of the streets. I think that an orthogonal building on the particular curvature of the development of Fenchurch would have been a mistake. Not a mistake, it would have been okay too, but I think it's, why not? I mean, if we can do it. Again, I think that the result is, this is another incredibly dangerous word that Ken referred to. I mean, you don't set yourself to make iconicity. It's a process of time. I mean, you can declare that it's iconic, but in a culture of the consumption of images, you get bored of these things, many years before you finish them, which is one of the great things about architecture, which is not part of the fashion system, even though we all are into it in a way. But you get bored before you actually finish the object. And I think that the thing that makes it permanent is the fact that I don't think you talk about something in the building, in your building, which I think has been incredibly criticized and I think is groundbreaking, which is this idea that in an extrusion, you can create spaces that actually relate the typical sort of succession of uniform floors. That's a contribution that the Gherkin made.
I think the Shard is a brilliant building, but two things I've heard about it. One is it's a great building in the wrong place, and the second is that the residential apartments will be purchased as safety deposit boxes out of Dubai and China, and people will not live in the building. Could you just, those are not necessarily my views, by the way, but could you address those 2 points?
Let's deal with the first point, the location. London Bridge is the third busiest rail station in the country. So from a transportation point of view, which happens to be what I think is good location, is a number one plus. And it always was a good location. When we bought it, actually, it was downhill, it was not looking particularly good. But historically, it happened to be two things. It was the first bridge the Romans built across the Thames, and it was the location for the first rail terminus in this country, 1837. Its location. You've got a great indigenous population. It's very lively out of working hours. You've got so much going on in the immediate area, Borough Market, the Globe Theatre, the Unicorn. You've got more London there. So I, first of all, think it's probably one of the best locations, and I will promise that this will be a new district for London that will be as popular as a Covent Garden or a Chelsea in years to come. One. Two, the apartments. We have another development that we haven't started yet, and we're going to build 150 apartments, which will be mid-range, very close to the two buildings. The other apartments are special. There are 10 of them. They're an average of 6,000 square feet, 360-degree views, and at the very top of the building, just beneath the viewing gallery. I've had approaches from people who are not from Dubai. I've had approaches from Chinese, Australians, and the US. And I think, yeah, it will be a special apartment. I can't afford one. And they may be used a year, once a month a year, twice a month. But it will be part of a collection by certain people who want a special apartment. They want one of the 10. And it will be serviced by the Shangri-La Hotel for every need you possibly want. And I don't really see what's wrong with that. It's special.
I mean, do you have an idea of what what the typical occupancy of the residential part of the building would be in a typical week? Any idea of that?
No, I don't know. I don't know. The building is, you've got over 900,000 square feet. The apartments occupy 62,000. I would expect them to be fairly busy.
Yeah.
Thanks. It's a quick question of clarification to Kent from Siena Strelitz. Could you just clarify the protection that you have on the appearance of the gherkin in imagery? Is it a matter of emphasis? Is it any appearance, any representation of the building in an image for commercial purposes? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's okay to photograph the building, and it's okay to show the photograph or photographs of the skyline. When you start getting into difficult territory and encroaching on the copyright and the trademark is when you use that photograph to, on its own, associate it with your brand, or alternatively where you make an impression of the building, so not a photograph but a drawing or something showing the helixes, and then you associate that or you use that in some way, then it will be an infringement. So it's a bit of a spectrum, but generally where you've got a photograph and it's just of the skyline and there's juxtaposition against that, it won't be a problem. As you move just towards using the building itself and you change it or draw it, then you encroach. And similarly with the use of the name gherkin, that's protected and only in relation to that building.
Could you please join me in a final round of applause for 3 excellent speakers?